Thank you everybody for coming. Glad to be back in the classroom and doing this. It's been a while. So show of hands, how many have been to one of my classes before or one of the Taproot events? Yep, recognize a few people. Sweet, so like a lot of new people today, which is awesome. Really glad to see that. I know some of you made the trip from a distance, you know, a couple hours drive or more. I think we got somebody from New York City came up. And just really appreciate you guys coming and doing this with us, because if we don't get people interested, we don't get to do this. So thank you all for whatever it took to get you here. My name is Aaron, and just a quick background on myself. I've been a professional cannabis grower for about 12 years now. I grew up in this area, but I moved to Colorado in 2009. At which point I wasn't even really into weed at all. And when I got out there, it was everywhere. So I ended up kind of being like, this is cool. And I tried a little grow tent out in my house, and it was awesome. Fell in love with it and was like, I think I want to switch careers. So in 2010, I broke into the newly legalizing industry in Colorado as a trimmer, starting from the ground up. And I got my first head grower position in, I believe it was 2012, and that was a warehouse in Colorado. And at the beginning of my career, I didn't know, obviously, anywhere near what I know about growing now, and I just kind of did the same thing that most people do, which is go to the grow store, find out from my friends, how do you grow this plant? You know, I followed the instructions on the back of my nutrient bottles and looked some things up online and kind of taught myself. I started out doing like a drain to waste coconut core type of system. And that's kind of like how most people grow, is they use an inert medium and they use nutrients that feed their plant with that inert medium, because there's no nutrition in that soil per se, depending on what kind of blend you get. So today what we're here to talk about is a totally different approach to that, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, but living soil relies on the living microorganisms and the cycling of nutrition through the soil food web to feed your plants. So what we're going to teach you here today is how to design and make and build and then maintain a living soil that you only need to feed water to. And I'll get into why this is advantageous and why we don't feed nutrients on top of that, you know, because a lot of people will build a great soil and then they're like, oh, but I can also add fertilizer and get extra yields. But there's reasons why we don't do that too. So long story short, back to my background, it was probably 8 or 9 years ago that I was running a commercial grow op in Colorado. And some of the people on my team always had this weed that was like a lot better than mine. And it drove me crazy. I was like, what the hell is this? Like, I'm the professional here, and these home growers are coming in with this weed. We'd go on break, lunch break and whatever, and we'd be smoking this stuff, and I'm like, oh my God, like, who is growing this, and why is it so good? Flavor-wise, the high and the efficacy, everything about it was just phenomenal. And my friend would tell me, he's like, it's because it's grown with soil and water. There's no fertilizer, there's no pesticides, there's no nothing. This is like clean soil and water grown, and that's why it's so smooth and has so much complexity in the flavor. So I had to figure this out. I was like, you know, I'm not going to keep doing it the way I'm doing if there's this other results that I can get. And I always thought my weed was good too. I was proud of my work, and you know, I was growing on a commercial scale, so I thought it was cool. And you know, I went to go figure this out. I started doing research, teaching myself. I put myself through a number of classes. I did the soil food web programs from Elaine Ingham, if anyone's familiar with those. I took microscopy with her and learned how to identify microorganisms in the soil. And because I was already in the commercial grow space, as I learned to do this, I implemented it at home and in my quasi-legal, gray market operations back in the day. And I began to scale it out. And the last job that I had before I moved here back to New York was running what I believe is the biggest no-till living soil facility in the country. It's called Eden, and it's in Parachute, Colorado. And it's like a state-of-the-art facility. It was like my dream facility. And they had, I don't know how many hundreds of beds. It was 2 greenhouse facilities that were 40,000 square feet apiece. And we implemented my living soil systems at that scale very effectively, and Eden still uses my exact protocol and methodologies all the way till today. And they're a really well-known company out in Colorado. So a lot of people wonder whether this can be done at scale, and the answer is absolutely yes. We were the largest single-source rosin company by cultivation square footage in the entire state of Colorado. And yeah, how you doing, guys? Welcome. So this can be done at scale, and not only can it be done at scale, but it can be done at scale for a very low cost of operation. So we're going to get into today how this can actually not only increase your quality, but it can save you money, no matter what scale you're on. So let me take another little show of hands survey. How many home growers do we have here? Okay, like half the room. Anybody a commercial grower or a professional grower? One over here. How you doing, man? I recognize you. And then, are there any gardeners, vegetables, or farm growers? Awesome. This is applicable too, whether it's outdoors or indoors. Same principles apply. So let's get into it. Any questions for me first before we get started on background or anything like that? Cool. Okay, so as I said, we're going to learn to design a soil, how to mix it and make it, and then once you have it, how do you maintain it and keep it alive? That's the purpose of today's class. And let's start with the definition of a living soil. So what does that mean? A lot of times there's confusion about this. Some people think that anything with anything alive in it is qualified as a living soil, and technically you could say that that's true. You could go buy a bag of Fox Farm Ocean Forest from the grocery store, and you could inoculate that with some Recharge or some Great White or another microbial inoculant product like that, and then you could call it a living soil. However, what we're talking about here is going to be a lot more specific to no-till and large container gardening. So you will hear me say this over and over again throughout the course of the day. If you want to use a living soil and really have it be effective in the ways that we're talking about today, you're going to want to do it in large containers. And one of the biggest reasons for that is because that volume of medium is actually what's required to support certain levels of biology. So you can make a soil like the one we're going to make, and you can then load it up into 5-gallon pots, but you're just not going to get the same result that we're talking about here. So when we're talking about a soil like this in a small container, I'm just going to refer to that as a super soil. So you guys have probably heard that term before, right? Okay. Super soil's like a soil that you can just mostly feed water to, and then a lot of times, even if you're in a small container, as long as you don't get your plants too big, you'll be able to finish at least one round of a crop cycle without having to add any nutrients, and you can just feed plain water. But we're talking about large container, no-till living soil where you don't ever have to replace that, because if you're using a super soil and it's in a small container, you might get one round out of that, but then the plant and anything you've grown in the container is going to suck up a lot of that nutrition, and you're going to be left with a depleted soil after 1 or 2 rounds. So by having a large volume, one of the things that we do is we provide enough nutrition to the plants that you're not going to deplete it every cycle, and you can then add back to it gradually. And you could even go 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 cycles. Once you get your soil dialed in, you really don't even need to re-amend it very much if you follow the practices for maintaining the soil that we'll talk about today. So what makes a good living soil? And we're going to get into all of the different characteristics that we want it to have, and then the ingredient list that I'm going to present to you guys today will make a lot more sense, because each one of these ingredients is designed to create a specific texture, structure, and nutrient and mineral balance that's ideal for not just your plants, but really the microbiology, because that's what we're relying on to feed the plants, is the biology. So don't think of it today as we build the soil, don't think of it as I'm building something for my plants. What we're doing is building a home and a food source for the biology. And if you can get that right, then the plant will take care of itself. So some of the qualities that we want our soil to have that are going to make it effective for our plants is going to be porosity, and a structure that can breathe, has proper gas exchange from the soil to the air and vice versa. It's going to retain water effectively, so that when you water it, it's not just like sand and it just, washes out. It's going to not retain too much water though, because if you've got a really heavy clay soil or something that's full of a product like vermiculite, that stuff holds on to water a little bit too much, and that will create an anaerobic sort of home for microbiology, which isn't conducive to your plant growth. So we want the right amount of aeration and porosity for air and gas exchange, combined with the right amount of moisture holding capacity. Another thing we want our soils to have is generous amounts of organic matter, because organic matter is going to break down over time and slowly release nutrition. And it's also the home for a lot of the biology that we have there. So let's get into the soil food web. Before we start talking about specific ingredients, who here is familiar with the term soil food web? Somebody want to tell me what your definition of it would be? Yeah, basically yes. And all the organisms that are in that, right? So if you have an ecosystem like a jungle, for example, you're going to have everything there from bacteria and microbiology to bugs to birds to mammals, and then you'll have all the way up to the apex predators of an ecosystem. So like we're talking eagles and cheetahs and gorillas or whatever's at the top of the food chain, right? And the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more species of life that it has and the more things that are happening. So if you're in the Amazon rainforest, you've got like a lot of different species of life there, as opposed to a desert where there's not as much. And of course, the plants in one are very fertile, versus in a desert, you might not have very much plant life at all. So that's all part of the cycle of life. And what we're trying to create is an ecosystem that has the most robust and most diverse variety of life that we can possibly get. So the soil food web, as you see here, this is a pretty basic diagram that is like the first thing that pops up if you Google soil food web. And so there's a lot more to it than this, but we call it a web and not a food chain because it's not exactly linear. It's not like this eats this, which then eats this, and it goes in a straight line. It's like this is here. It's kind of like everything's eating a little bit of everything else. And it's very overlapped, very layered. But to make things like summarized here, the main organisms that we're going to talk about today are going to be the microbiology and the categories of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, and maybe some microarthropods and bugs and stuff like that. If we go next door, you guys will get to see as you pull back a mulch layer of our soil, you've got worms, bugs, you got all sorts of things running around in there because the soil is alive. So the more larger things that we can see with our naked eye, those are kind of like the apex predators of the soil food web. Like a worm is pretty big. There's not anything really eating a worm in the soil food web. And a lot of the larger insects and stuff like that. We even have some frogs and toads in there. So I don't know if we'll see them or not, but those are, you know, kind of top of the food chain. When those things are present and surviving, you know that you have a thriving ecosystem, because you can't support a cheetah in the wild without food for the cheetah, but that food needs food of its own, and that food needs food of its own. So it goes, you know, all the way back. We'll get more specific into the soil food web, but actually when I'm here, I want to talk about who here is growing in soil already? Is there anybody that's already on living soil using plain water? Sweet. Okay. And then I assume the rest of you guys are probably using nutrients of some kind, organic or synthetic. We'll talk about the differences here. But the bottom line, if any of you saw my latest post about this class, is that you've got a few different things you're in control of when you're growing these plants, right? Your environment, which you can dial into specific parameters if you have a well-built grow room or greenhouses like these. If you're growing outside, weather is what it is, so can't control that, right? And then you've got your genetics. So no matter what you do, your genetics will limit the potential of your results. No matter how good of a grower you are, if you've got a genetic that just isn't going to produce certain compounds, it's not going to, you know, grow certain ways, you're gonna be limited by that, obviously, right? But if you can get your genetics and your environment dialed in, the other thing that's left to look at after that is what you're feeding the plants. So the difference here, and this is why we believe, one of the many reasons we believe that this is the best way to grow, is if your goal is quality, I should preface it with that, because if your goal is yield, absolutely go for it with the nutrients, right? Like, I can't lie to you and tell you that you're gonna out yield somebody in a deep water culture or drain to waste cocoa system. You're probably not gonna get the same yields with this. However, you can get excellent yields. I mean, very respectable commercial yields of 40, 50 grams per square foot, which is really good. So if you're okay with yields like that and you want the highest quality possible, living soil is going to be the way. And the main reason for that is because if you are using a fertilizer, what humans can manufacture in that product is a small box, right? And a lot of the fertilizers will tell you on the back of the bottle or on the product label somewhere what the ingredients are. So let's use nitrogen for an example. You might have ammonium nitrate, EDTA, and you'll see that on the back of the bottle. The EDTA is the chemical salt that is chelated to the elements of ammonium and nitrate. And the chelation means that it's locked onto to those atoms in a form that makes it plant available. It's bioavailable for uptake. And that's what allows hydroponic growers or growers in soilless mediums to feed a fertilizer to their plant and have it go straight in. Because in those mediums, there's no soil food web like this that's actually doing the chelation naturally. So chelation is a word you'll hear me say a lot, and that just means, in Latin, it means to claw onto. So you picture little chemistry diagrams of molecules, right? And you know it'll be like NO3 is a nitrate molecule, and that's one atom of nitrogen combined with 3 oxygen. So that's, you know, whatever shape that's in. Now you bring a chelator into it. So a chelator could be EDTA, which is the one that's usually used for synthetic nutrients, or it could also be an organic acid or some kind of byproduct of something from the soil food web. Because in nature, the way that things naturally happen is nutrients are mined and taken in by microbiology first. So if you've got, say, atmospheric nitrogen, and it's in the gas pockets of the soil, and then you've got a nitrogen fixing bacteria. This is an example, I just keep using nitrogen here. But let's say you have rhizobium, and that's a species of bacteria that fixes nitrogen by consuming it from the soil atmosphere. And most of the air that we breathe is actually nitrogen. A high percentage of it's nitrogen. A lot of it is carbon dioxide too, oxygen. But that air exchange is going into the soil, and then microorganisms are taking that into their own bodies because they need nutrition too. This is their food, right? When they take that into their bodies, they will combine it with other elements and then make their own byproducts, whether it's a waste byproduct or whether it actually stays in their bodies. So the soil food web is a constant cycling of nutrition because the organisms within it are eating, they're essentially peeing, pooping, dying, getting grazed upon by higher forms of life, and there's just a constant turnover of nutrition. But as that turnover is happening, as that cycling of nutrition goes on, the forms of the different elements are being converted and chelated, remember that word, into bioavailable forms, which then go into the nutrient solution and can be uptaken by plants. That's one way that our plants take up nutrition. So if you're looking at just that one way, think of the nitrogen diet that you're feeding your plant. And if you have one nutrient that is ammonium nitrate EDTA chelate, and you pour that into your solution, and that's the only nitrogen that your plant gets throughout its whole life, you're missing out on all of these other forms of nitrogen, all of these other different ways that your plant can take in nitrogen. It can take up nitrogen as amino acids. It can take up nitrogen as proteins, like fully formed proteins and fats. There's nitrogen in all sorts of different compounds that make up the bodies and the waste byproducts, which we call metabolites, of the biology in your soil. And this is not just true for nitrogen, it's true for every single essential plant nutrient. So for calcium, there's all these different ways that it can be taken up. For phosphorus, same deal, right? And when you have a broad diversity of biology in the soil, imagine all of these species have different digestive systems. They have different processes of respiration, how they make their energy, how they construct their bodies. So the different forms are really vast. The more diversity in your soil that you have, the more complex your nutrient feed is going to be. It's kind of like how cows can't, a human, we can't go and eat grass like a cow. And the reason for that is our digestive systems don't have the enzymes that are necessary to break down that material. But a cow's stomach does. So by having both cows and humans, and imagine the equivalent of that in the soil. The bigger the diversity you have, the more different types of cycling you can get, and the broader diversity of nutrition. Now I'm going to mention two other ways of plant nutrient uptake right now, because all we've talked about so far is essentially like what goes into the soil solution. But there's also mycorrhizal fungi. Has anybody heard that term before? Yep, okay, so this is a type of fungus that forms a symbiotic relationship with plant roots. And the type that does so with cannabis is called endomycorrhizal fungi. It's called endo because it grows into the actual cells of the plant roots. There's another type called ectomycorrhizal fungi that associates with species like trees, pine trees, and things like that. The ecto means it grows like in between. So when you use a mycorrhizal inoculant, if you look at the ingredient on the back, it'll have a bunch of different endomycorrhizal species. And these are the ones usually that have been studied and known to associate with the plants that you're growing. So the fungi that form this relationship, they're essentially like an extension of the plant's root system. And sometimes they will like very drastically expand the capacity of a root system, like 3, 4 more times volume, and it spreads out into the soil, and these fungi mine the soil for their own nutrients, just like all the rest of the soil food web members. As they do that, they're going to uptake their own nutrition, but they're going to take in more than they need, and they're going to funnel that nutrition right straight to your plant. So one of the benefits of having a diverse soil food web is that you can get nutrients from the soil solution that are being solubilized by the microbes, but you're also getting stuff mainlined straight in from organisms like these. A third way of nutrient uptake I want to talk about is something that's kind of newer. Has anybody heard about the rhizophagy cycle yet? One person, anybody? Okay, so there's a great book on this from Jeff Lowenfels, who wrote a series of books called Teaming with Microbes. He's got Teaming with Microbes, Teaming with Nutrients, Teaming with Fungi, and he just came out with one called Teaming with Bacteria, which is all about the rhizophagy cycle. And this is absolutely fascinating, because what's happening is scientists have discovered that plants are not only getting nutrients from symbiotic relationships like mycorrhizae, from solubilized nutrition, but they're also consuming whole microbes live. The roots will actually engulf microorganisms, bacteria in particular, and they're basically eating it. And it's called rhizophagy because rhizo means root, and phagy stands for eating. These are like the Latin roots of these words. So you can think of it as the root eating cycle, the rhizophagy cycle. So plants engulf these microorganisms, take them into their root cells, and then they exude a superoxidate, which is meant to dissolve the bacterial cell wall. So what happens is the bacteria inside the plant roots, the cell walls of them get dissolved by this oxidate, and they become a naked protoplast inside, just like a floating blob inside the root cell. And the plant is able to extract whatever nutrition it wants from that cytoplasm of the bacteria. Now, what's even more fascinating is that a lot of the time it does this without killing the bacteria. It actually takes what it needs without killing that microbe, and then out the tips of the root hairs, it ejects the bacteria back into the soil as it allows it to reform its cell wall. So it's essentially, and we've kind of known this already, like Elaine Ingham teaches this, is like, your plant is in charge of the biology in the soil. It's literally farming the microbes. If the plant was a rancher, the microbial community would be its herd of cattle and sheep and goats and whatever, right? It's deciding when to feed those microbes. It's taking them in, you know, like maybe it's like bringing them into the barn when it does this rhizophagy thing. And then it spits them back out, and it says, basically, go out there and replace what I took from you, okay? But the one thing I haven't talked about yet is it's doing this with something called root exudates. And what a root exudate is essentially a sugar profile. It's mostly carbohydrates, a lot of glucose and things like that, but it's not just simple sugars. It can be more complex, and the healthier your plant is, usually the more complex and also the higher quantity of root exudates it will exude into the soil. That's why it's called an exudate, because it exudes that into the soil. It's actually taking probably half or more of the carbohydrates that it produces from photosynthesis and spitting it right out its root zone, and the purpose of that is to feed microbiology. So what's happening in the rhizosphere, The term rhizosphere means that area right around your plant roots where all of these microorganisms are living. In the rhizosphere, a diet of sugars is being exuded, and the microbiology is getting its carbon, its main source of carbon, from the plants itself, because the plants are making these sugars via photosynthesis. But microbes can't survive on just sugar alone, right? So they're drawn to the roots by the root exudates that are being produced, and then as they eat that carbon, they're like, okay, I need some phosphorus. Let me go find that in the soil. They go out into the soil, they'll use their enzymes, use their digestive processes to mine the soil for the other nutrients that it needs, and then they come right on back to the rhizosphere where they get their carbon. And because the carbon and the sugars, it's kind of like candy to microorganisms. Elaine Ingham calls it cookies and cupcakes. So your plants are providing the cookies and cupcakes, but it's not just that, it's carbon, so carbon is like the biggest nutrient. So people forget, they think NPK are the macronutrients. The real macronutrients are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We just don't talk about those, even though they're the largest quantity. We don't talk about those because they're supplied automatically from the environment. So anyway, I think that basically covers soil food web. Keep in mind as we go forward, the reason we're interested in growing this way is because this is how it happens naturally. And this natural cycling of nutrition is going to give the biggest diversity and the highest quality of nutrients to your plants. And that when you do that, as long as you got good genetics and you've got good environmental control, or if you have no environmental control and you're outside, then with good genetics and a good nutrient program, you're going to get the best results. And what we're going for here is terpenes, cannabinoids, unless you're growing other plants. I know there's some other farmers here too. But in cannabis, we're trying to create essential oil production, which is, those are secondary plant metabolites. And in order to produce a lot of them, and in order to produce a wide variety of them, your plant needs a complex diet. So anybody ever notice how weed that's grown with, say, Athena nutrients tastes the same no matter what grower does it? Like, this guy over here is growing with Athena, this person over here. Even across different strains sometimes, you're gonna get like, oh yeah, this sour diesel kind of tastes a lot like this OG or whatever. It's just kind of like, and that's because the box of your nutrition program is like this, instead of infinite, which is what a soil food web can produce for you. All right, so we're gonna move on. I might skip some slides here too, but this slide, and feel free to take pictures or whatever if you want to keep these slides and go over them later. But this is just a quick description of some of the things that these microorganisms do in the soil. I will say, so bacteria and fungi, and also another thing called archaea, which is similar to a bacteria, but it's kind of like, we think it may predate bacteria on the earth. Those are also plentiful. So bacteria and fungi are the base of your soil food web. The next kind of rung up, like these guys are kind of, the way Elaine describes it is like, they're your bags of fertilizer. Like, picture all the bacteria and fungi in your soil. Their bodies contain a whole bunch of nutrition. Now, they will live and die naturally. They will produce their waste products naturally. But the next level up, which isn't listed on this slide, but it's here, the protozoa, these are kind of like a manure spreader, or like, this is how your fertilizer, your bags of fertilizer, like the bacteria and stuff, that gets released and spread around. Because protozoa, their diets usually consist of bacteria. They'll eat a lot of microorganisms like bacteria, archaea, yeast, things like that. And as they do that, they're going to release those nutrients because, like, let's say a cheetah kills a gazelle. Well, the cheetah doesn't eat that entire gazelle. It usually leaves behind the bones, a lot of the hair. It leaves, might even leave a lot of meat on that if it doesn't need to eat the whole thing. And all of that extra goes back into the cycle. There's no waste in nature. It all gets recycled somewhere. So in a soil food web, a protozoa may be like a predator that grazes on or kills one of its prey. It'll take in what it wants from that, and then the rest of it kind of gets left behind. Scavenger species come around. There's scavengers at the micro level, just like there are, vultures and stuff at the larger size. So it's all this web, and it's all this cycling of nutrition that's happening. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about that. And I touched a little bit on the types of different grow mediums. I just want to define real quick. When I talk hydroponics, what I'm going to mean there is that includes direct water culture methodologies. So that would be something like aeroponics, like if you have a aerocloner where it's just spraying water and there's no medium, it's just like misting or spraying water onto the plant roots. That would be called aeroponics, and that's a form of hydroponics. Deep water culture is another direct water culture method. But when I say hydroponics, I kind of also mean soilless media as well. So a soilless media is an inert medium like coconut coir, peat moss, if anybody's using like ProMix or something like that. That media does not have any nutrient in it, and its purpose is to give the plant roots a structure to grow into and to hold the plant up, but all your nutrition is going to come from whatever fertilizer you're using. So when I say hydro or hydroponics, usually I'm just talking about something where all the nutrition is being fed in water, hydroponically like that, in soil solution. Natural and agricultural soil, that's going to be earth. What we're talking about outdoors. If you're growing outdoors and you're just planting straight into the ground, maybe you amend it a little bit, or maybe you're just, tilling for aeration and texture and structure, but then you plant right into it. That's going to be a natural or agricultural soil. And then we have what we're going to make today, which falls into the category of potting soil. Now, a lot of companies call their products potting soil, and they might be way closer to an inert medium, like a soilless medium, than they are to an actual soil. So, because when I say soil, what I think of is that a soil should be alive. There should be actual life in the soil, and it shouldn't just be an inert medium. So that's what we're going to make here, but keep in mind that if you're at the store and you're trying to buy bags of soil or something, a lot of times it'll be called potting soil, and it's really just like a whole bunch of peat moss or coconut coir mixed with like perlite or some aeration component. And then they'll say that they have like some humus in there or something like that. It's really those components that you can find in a bagged soil are going to be way inferior to what you could put into a blend you make yourself. So I'm hoping that everybody leaves today knowing that it's very simple and easy to make a soil that is like so far beyond superior to anything you can buy that you would only ever want to do this. Like, not only is it way better quality, but you're going to save money too. You have to be willing to put in a little sweat equity with the shovel, but if that's worth it to you to get a better product and to spend less on ingredients, then I would highly recommend it. Okay, so let's talk about texture, and this mostly has to do with agricultural soils. So you guys might have seen this triangle before. Like regular natural soil is made up of 4 components: sand, silt, and clay. And those 3 components are distinguished by the particle size. Sand is going to be like the largest particle. Silt is the medium size or next smallest down. And clay is like a very small particle. And the reason why clay is, sticks together and stuff like it does is because it's so small. It's a very, very small particle, and it holds onto water a lot. And then the fourth component, in addition to sand, silt, and clay, is organic matter. In nature, most of the time, this is coming from detritus, which means it's the decaying plant material from the previous year. That could be leaves falling from the trees and, decomposing, and those leaves are going to break down to become next year's fertilizer, right? Which is crazy why people rake up all the leaves from their lawn, because, you're just taking away the food for your lawn and the trees. It's better off to leave them there. But the organic matter component is very, very important, because that's where you're going to get a large amount of your microbiology, and it's also a food source, as well as it contributes to the structure and texture of your soil. So a typical agronomic soil has anywhere like 3 to 5, 6% organic matter. If you got 5% organic matter or higher in a regular outdoor soil, you're doing very well. Like, most farmers are shooting for a number like that, and especially when you go on to larger broad acre farming endeavors, you're not going to be making a third of your mix out of compost like we're doing today. Like, that would cost an absolute fortune to amend, hundreds of acres with that much compost. So you're not doing that on a big scale. But 5 or 6% is excellent when you're outdoors. We're making a custom soil, so you're going to see that our organic matter percentage is probably going to be 20% or higher. In fact, the testing labs that we use basically stop measuring at 20%. So you'll see that on our soil test it says greater than 20% instead of the actual number. If you're ever outside and you want to test what your soil texture is, you can do this jar test thing right here, which is like, I've got that little thing. Basically, you just take your soil, put it in a jar, fill it with water, and shake it up and let it sit and settle. And then your layers will separate like this, and you can tell what kind of soil texture you have. So a clay loam or a loam right in the middle of this triangle, bottom center here, this is what most farmers are shooting for, because that texture is going to give them the right porosity and the right structure to have good gas and water, good gas exchange, water retention, and all that stuff we already talked about. So that's texture. Texture's like, what is it made up of? How much sand, silt, and clay? How much organic matter? Structure refers to how the soil aggregates. It's how it clumps together and how the gas exchange and porosity, the water holding potential, all of that stuff is created. And this has a lot to do with the biology, okay? So if you've got a nice loamy soil, which we're gonna make like the perfect texture light soil today, that's one nice thing about potting soil is you get to say what components are in there, so you don't have to build it it's too much clay or too much sand or whatever. In fact, we're not going to use any sand, silt, or clay. We're just going to use some peat moss, which is a very, very good medium for both moisture holding capacity and porosity and aeration. But it's the microbiology that oftentimes creates, not just the microbiology, but all the biology. Imagine worms going through your soil, right? They produce that slime on the outside of their bodies. So they're making tunnels through the soil, and they're leaving behind residues that are full of biology themselves. They're helping to create the aggregates that occur in the soil. So you have individual particles like this, and as they get stuck together by basically the slimes and the stuff that the biology creates, because microbes create different types of slimes and sticky things too. Fungus has a substance called glomalin, which holds together soil particles as well. You'll get aggregates, which are like a bunch of particles stuck together, and then the collection of all your aggregates is what's going to form your overall soil structure. So again, the more life you have and the higher the diversity of that life, the better your structure is going to be. The aeration component is something that's really important because it allows the soil to breathe and not get waterlogged. So this is just a list of some of the different options that you have. One thing I'll say right now too, we're using perlite for our demonstration here, but perlite is not an ideal ingredient for what we talk about doing because it breaks down very easily. If you guys have ever stepped on perlite, it just like turns to dust. It's also lightweight and it will float and also get worked to the surface by things like worms and stuff. So if you make a long-term no-till mix and you use perlite as an aeration component, you have to keep in mind that I wouldn't expect that to last for, 5 to 10 years or something. You might get a good 2 years or something out of it before it starts to lose the benefit of the aeration that perlite is designed for, and then it will potentially become compacted. The other thing is when it raises to the top and it turns into that dust and you water, it kind of turns into this like cement almost. So sometimes if you see people that ran a container with perlite in it for too long, it's got like this layer of hardened stuff on top of it, which is basically perlite dust that's all clumping up together when you water it. So perlite's not ideal, but we're going to use some today because it's really tough to find volcanic rock around here. One of the other things I would recommend, it's not listed on here, but if you guys want a good local source for aeration, I would recommend expanded shale. And that can be had at different landscaping yards. There's some factories around here that produce expanded shale because New York and this area has a lot of shale, but we don't have a lot of lava rock because there's no volcanoes here historically. So that's your aeration. Now organic matter, when we talk about its part in the mix, we're mainly referring to compost. And your compost is the most important part of your soil mix. Peat moss you can buy anywhere, your aeration you can buy whatever, they're gonna serve their purposes, but the better quality compost you can get, the better your soil is gonna do. And you can actually get really crappy compost and make this exact recipe that we're gonna do today and not have a lot of success with it. So that's how important the compost is you really wanna make sure that you've got a good quality compost. You don't want a compost that's not finished. For example, if you get a compost from a manufacturer that didn't take enough time to let that compost finish, it's gonna be hot. And then you'll mix it into your soil will be hot because it's still, the activity of the biology, when I say hot, what I mean is there's still a lot of activity literally creating heat and creating other byproducts that aren't good for your plant growth. So you gotta make sure your compost is mature and finished. And then it's a good idea too, if you know how to take a look at it under a microscope. Make sure that there's no pathogenic stuff in there. And we'll talk about microscopy a little more later. But it's really good if you have that skill to be able to look at your compost and see what kind of biology you're dealing with. Also, you can, for a very inexpensive price, get a compost analysis done by a lab. And it'll actually tell you what the nutritional profile of that compost is. So I would recommend all of those things. In addition to compost, when we talk about organic matter, we're also talking about plant residues and the microbial biomass, because living plants and living bugs and microbes and worms and all of that, that's organic matter. For something to be organic, it must be carbon-based. So an example of something that's inorganic would be the rock dust we're going to use here. There's no carbon in the rock dust, but there's plenty of carbon in plant residues and living microbial biomass. There's also plenty of carbon in detritus and mulch. So like we're going to talk about mulching and how what you put on top of your beds is, and what that breaks down into, how it breaks down, how quickly or slowly it breaks down. All of that is going to be long-term food for your biology, and that's part of your organic matter component. Then there's this third component of organic matter that's called humus. And humus, as you see on the bottom line here, is the final product of decomposition. In fact, the fungal digestive process is often referred to as humification, because the way that fungus digests organic matter is a little different than bacteria. Fungus will actually continue to break down organic matter over and over again. It'll keep reconsuming until it's left with basically stabilized carbon. It's going to use up most of all the other components of it, leaving you with humus, which is, it doesn't contain nutrition anymore. However, it's still organic matter, and it is a crucial and very beneficial part of a soil. So the more humus you have in your soil, usually the better it is. Humus contributes to cation exchange capacity, which is basically, I'll go over that in a minute, but that's how much nutrients your soil can hold. And even though humus particulate doesn't have nutrition itself, the electrical charge that it has and the structure of it allows it to hold on to other nutrition. So it'll basically lock that nutrition up and hold on to it until it can go into solution, or until some other microorganism comes by and frees it up from its bond. It's bonded to the humus, and then biology comes, breaks that bond, takes it into its own body, or solubilizes it straight into solution, so it can feed the plants. So humus is absolutely huge. I'll talk about cation exchange capacity in a minute when we go into the chemistry part. But this is some of what I've already been saying, is that these are some of the benefits of having really good organic matter. And then a couple that I haven't mentioned yet are going to be the pH buffering. I got into it on a post with somebody the other day about whether or not you need to pH your water when you're growing in living soil. And a lot of you may have heard that that's something you don't have to worry about anymore. It's a nice benefit to growing this way is all of that chemical adjustment of the pH. You just don't have to do it because the biology is doing it. If the biology wasn't doing it, they wouldn't be able to survive. Just like the organs in our own body, like our body self-regulates our own pH. Your blood is a specific pH all the time. You know, your organs and your internal stuff has to maintain that. And the biology in the soil kind of does the same thing. Collectively, that whole ecosystem of the soil food web is going to result in, if it's a healthy soil food web, is going to result in the right pH for your plants. And it's something you just don't have to think about anymore, which is really great. In addition, like we feed RO water here. So it's filtered and there's nothing in it, and you don't want to pH RO anyway. So that's one of the reasons, that's one of the nice things, is you don't have to do that anymore. Last thing I'll touch on is the bottom line of accelerated mineral decomposition. Because your organic matter is high and the biology is there with it, that's what creates the accelerated release of nutrients from your minerals. One thing I'll say about this slide is, again, we are designing a soil for the biology, not for the plants. So having the right mix of nutrition is basically like you're setting up the diet for your microbes. We already know our plants need all the essential nutrients, right? So there's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are what they call our macronutrients. Calcium and magnesium are sometimes included in that because they're needed in such high quantities. And then there's your micros. Micronutrients are things like boron, iron, magnesium, or manganese, molybdenum, copper. You know, there's a whole bunch of them, and we keep discovering more things that we didn't even know. Like plants take up selenium and aluminum, and in very small quantities. So, you know, we didn't necessarily know that they like silver and all these, like, but in very small amounts. When we design our soil, we have to make sure that all of these things are there, because if the plant needs it, that means the biology needs it and needs to be able to cycle it in order to get it to our plants. So what we're doing here is basically creating the structure to make it a good home for biology, and then we're going to include all the nutrition so that the biology there has enough to eat all the time. And essentially we want to provide more than enough, so that, and we want to introduce along the way. Like, we'll talk to you guys about how we're top dressing certain things during certain parts of the cycle, because we want to see an explosion of microbial populations at certain times. So, you know, we'll top dress fermented plant scraps and fermented fruit scraps and things like that sometimes, because we know it's going to feed certain biology, which will then result in an explosion of other biology. It's going to feed our plants. So let's talk about testing real quick. It's a good idea, even though we know that this mix, like you guys, if you never do a soil test, if you make this mix, you can plant straight into it and your plants will be healthy right away. I promise you they will do really great. However, if you're going to alter the mix at all, or if you just want to know how to top dress or amend along the way, it's a good idea to send in samples to a good lab. And that lab will perform 2 different types of tests. By the way, I recommend Logan Labs here. In my opinion, they are the best lab in the country, and they provide all of the information that you need to make the adjustments and analyze what to amend with. And so a lot of, you know, like you could send your soil samples to Cornell or another lab like that, but they just don't provide as much information as Logan Labs does. So I highly, highly recommend using Logan Labs, because they're just going to give you the most complete information. Here is an example of the 2 types of tests that you will get if you pay $65 to Logan Labs. Really not very much money at all, especially considering like you just want to, maybe you just want to do this at least once at the beginning to make sure that your soil is balanced the way that you want it to be. The first one is that says soil report on it. This is what's known as a Mehlich 3 standard soil test. Mehlich 3 refers to the acid that they use to dissolve it. So you're going to send your sample in. They will put it in an oven, basically, and dry it all out. And then they'll use an acid to dissolve it, and then they will analyze the results of that in their lab equipment, which will spit out these numbers. It'll tell you what you've got here. Now, if you don't know how to read this, this could be like kind of confusing and a daunting thing to look at. But the good news is that for an additional, usually I think it's just $30, there are a number of agronomists out there who their profession is analyzing these types of things. And so you can pay less than $100 to get both your testing done and get a professional analysis by an agronomist that will tell you, okay, you're a little low in calcium and we recommend that you amend some gypsum to correct that. So it's really great. You don't even have to know how to read these, and you also can learn if you want to. If you want to learn, I highly suggest it, because especially if you're a professional grower, knowing how to read, understand, and analyze these reports is something that will deepen your understanding of what you're doing and what works for your soil food web. So anyway, Mehlich 3 standard soil test on the left. When they do this, this is basically going to tell you what is in your soil. And it's going to break down, here's how many parts per million of each of these different elements, okay? A saturated paste report, however, oops. What this does, and you can send in your own water with this too, which I also highly recommend. If you should test your soil and your water before you start growing, so that you know, because every time you water, you're not just putting H2O in there. The water has dissolved solids in it that is going to also now be in your soil. So if your water, has high sodium or chloride, how many parts per million of that is in your water? And then you know, okay, every time I water, I'm adding, say, 20 parts per million of sodium. Okay? And that's good to know, because that could build up, and having too much sodium or too much chloride or really too much of anything will throw your whole balance off and your results will be impacted. So test your water first, know what's in it. If it's anything that's out of whack, then you can just filter the water and use an RO system like we do, something like that, just to make sure that you're not going to throw off your soil balance with your water. But when you send your own water into the lab, they will use that water in the saturated paste test. So what the saturated paste report does is they basically make a slurry with the soil sample that you sent and the water that you send in, and it will tell you what is going into solution from your soil. So with this, they're testing the solution. And so now you know from these two tests what's in my soil, and then when I add my water to it, what goes into solution just naturally. Very important, very useful information. Once you know that, like I said, you can get an agronomic analysis. Couple of the tools I recommend are, there's an agronomist who is a cannabis specialist. His name's Bryant Mason, and he goes by the Soil Doctor. If you ever want to have some good input from a cannabis-based agronomy professional, I highly recommend using him. He charges like $50 or something like that for an actual, what's that?
I think it's only 30.
It's 30 for the tool that he has. If you want to talk to him, it's only a little bit more. I think it's like $50 to $80.
75 bucks.
75? Nice. Thank you, Trev. Yeah, so if you want to talk to him specifically and ask him questions, you can pay a little bit more, which is definitely valuable sometimes. But if you just... What's that?
Kiss Organics.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so he's got an agronomist, or is one?
Yeah.
Cool.
They're who I use.
Yep. And Logan Labs has one too. So Kiss Organics is a soil company out of Washington. They make really good soil. Apparently have an agronomist on staff.
They do a consultation with Logan. Yep.
Nice, nice.
You can find it all just through KISS with the Logan test and their recommendations.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome. There's a lot of companies like that, like Build a Soil, if you guys have heard of that one, is another one. They make soil that they rigorously test, and they have, and actually Bryant Mason from Soil Doctor is the agronomist that they work with mainly. But the lab itself, like Logan Labs, has their own agronomist. He's not a cannabis specific one because, he works with all different crops. So if you're maybe growing outdoors, or if you're growing a different crop, maybe you want to talk to the Logan Labs agronomist. If you're growing cannabis in a potting soil, Bryant Mason's really good. I'm sure that Tad Hussey from Kiss Organics is probably really great to talk to. Or, as I said before too, or you can learn for yourself. And there's a lot of different resources to do that. YouTube has a ton of different people who talk about soil balancing, soil mineral balancing. There's a really great book called The Intelligent Gardener by Steve Solomon, and that's probably where I'd recommend anybody start that want to learn about soil, mineral, and nutrient balancing. And then once you read that, if you want to spend some money to take a class, the Soil Doctor has a class that he offers. It's like $1,500, and you can learn exactly how to read and interpret both Mehlich 3 standard soil tests and saturated paste, and then how to calculate your own amendments for yourself. So really good tool. And the Soil Doctor tool, by the way, I was going to mention, that's actually a calculator that's online where you can get your soil test results and just go to this tool. You pay the $30 and you can just plug in your results and hit enter, and then it'll spit out your list of amendment recommendations for you. So kind of no excuse for the price and like how easy it is to do this. It's almost like a no-brainer. You know, definitely test your soils. If you're just a home grower though in a 4x4 tent and you don't want to go to all that trouble, I will say this is going to be fine. This is essentially what's called a Coots mix, and this blend, I have run this blend without testing it for over two to almost 3 years. Same soil with just Coots mix, and I never tested it, and all I ever did was like top dress some basic all-purpose dry amendments, and it got great results. So you guys can do that too, but if you want to get into the testing, and especially if you're doing it farm scale, I really, really recommend testing and getting some agronomic advice added in. When you're selecting amendments, I'm basically going to skip over this, but just be careful that you're not getting stuff that is poor quality. Like a lot of the slaughterhouse byproducts that come from, you know, like bone meal, blood meal, things like that, they can be good amendments, but you really got to watch where the source is, where that's coming from, and what is in it. You know, you can get any amendment tested individually too. There's all different ways to do that. If you're wondering, like, is this a good amendment to use? Is it going to have, you know, something I don't want in it? You just want to look for contamination and make sure that if it's something like alfalfa meal or something like that, like you want to get that organic. You know, something that doesn't have pesticide and herbicide sprayed on it, because if you get something that has that, you're really gonna do some damage to your plants and your soil. So if you have a trusted source, like if you're buying your amendments from KISS Organics or Build a Soil or something like that, you don't have to do that work because they've already done that. They've done the background to make sure that it'll be safe. I'm going to skip this, but that's just like talks about how natural soil has layers in it. And we'll go to making the soil in a second here. Before we get to that, I just want to talk about the management of the biology. And we'll do the mixing last. So I'm gonna go right to how to manage the mix. Like pretend you've already got this all mixed up. It's loaded in your containers and you're using it. You want to check, one of the first things you want to do is check your biology. So if you know how to do that with a microscope, you can. Also, you can send in soil samples for biological assay, meaning testing, to a number of different labs too. Like there's one called EarthFort. They will do a biological assay and actually tell you what percentage of microbial biomass is fungus, what percentage is bacteria, how much protozoa you have of different types. Like they actually have a lab tech on a microscope going field by field and counting these microorganisms to make that report. So that's a really cool tool that you can use if you don't yet have the microscopy skill yourself. But it's very important. At the base level, you just want to make sure that you don't have pathogenic microorganisms in your soil. The way we make it, you can be pretty confident that we're not going to have any pathogens in here today. But it's always good to check and make sure. And when you get into the more advanced management of your soil food web for cannabis, what we're always trying to do is build fungus, because bacteria is everywhere. It's just completely ubiquitous, and it's going to kind of take care of itself. Now, there are specific plant growth promoting rhizobacterias that you want to inoculate with. So what I recommend is two things. Number one, find a good inoculant product. So that's one with a broad spectrum of different microbial species in it. And usually that's going to be like 15 or 20 or maybe more different species. So one that we use here is called Rootwise Soil Dynamics. And they make a really great product. The guy who just broke the world record for the biggest pumpkin ever grown is using this inoculant. So I think they're getting some really good results. And I've been using it in cannabis for years, and it's a really good product. There's some other companies like there's one called Tineo Biologicals. And if anybody wants to write this stuff down or wants spelling of it, just come see me or ask me during Q&A. We can get back to it. But essentially you want a product that is live. So the spores and cysts of the microorganisms have to be viable, meaning it's going to usually be a dried out powder, and all of the microorganisms that are in that are going to be in hibernation because they don't have any moisture. They will encyst and create spores, if they're fungus, that will be dormant. And some of these things are crazy. They survive in like outer space. You know, like that's how some people theorize life on this planet began, is like bacteria or fungus or something came from outer space and started like living here. Who knows? But you want to make sure your spores and cysts and all of that stuff in that product are viable. So you can check on that with a microscope again, or you can just do a little research and find out what kind of reputation the company has. I would recommend against products like Recharge or Great White. Those have been shown to not have as active and viable biology as some of the fresher, higher quality. You know, you're going to pay something. Like Rootwise is expensive as hell. And you might see that and be like, oh my God, that is a lot of money to spend on microorganisms. But it is worth it. I'm telling you, it is the thing that makes the most noticeable, biggest difference is to inoculate with good biology. And so what I'm talking about here is the products you can buy to do that. Now, those products are only going to be the microorganisms that have been isolated and studied from plant rhizosphere, right? So like we as humans have gone in and taken samples of roots and stuff, and we have looked at those roots and said, okay, what is the biology that's living on these roots? We've isolated that biology, gene sequenced it, determined what it is, figured out how to rear it and grow it, basically, to culture it and to grow it. And then these companies have figured out how to make a product out of it. Now, 20 different species of biology is like actually nothing. Now, these are really important ones, so this is why I still recommend doing this, because these microbes are the ones that we know, we have studied them, and we know that they are very impactful to plant growth. You'll see them referred to as PGPR, plant growth promoting rhizobacterias, PGPRs. And then you have your mycorrhizal fungus as well. So it's going to have spores. Some of these inoculants will have spores of mycorrhizal fungi, and those need to come into direct contact with roots in order to germinate and in order to colonize the roots. So that's the product side of it. The other side of it is that there are way more than 20 or 30 different species in the soil food web and in the rhizosphere. These are just the ones that we know of and can reproduce, right? So you don't want to stop at just inoculating with a product. What you want to do is make a good compost tea or compost extract, which will then provide you with a much broader diversity. Probably literally millions, if not billions, of different species of microorganisms can be extracted from good compost or soil. And we'll talk about composting because, as I said earlier, compost is like #1 most important part of your soil recipe. Part of the reason for that is because the biology that lives in that compost is your inoculation source. So you can inoculate your soil by making a tea or an extract, but you can also inoculate by mixing it in. So if you've got good compost that's just blooming with all different types of microbiology. There's probably billions of different species of microorganisms in good compost. Just by mixing it into your soil, you're going to get those in your soil mix to begin with. And then I recommend that, just like with the product, you re-inoculate once every couple of weeks. So a compost tea or extract every couple of weeks, combined with a dose of your store-bought inoculant, will ensure that you continually maintain the diversity of the soil food web that you want. And then the other thing you want to do is keep mulching. I just saw that here. So you want to keep, by mulch, you know, everybody knows what mulch is in general. It's just stuff that you throw on top of your soil. And that stuff's not going to be something that's available right away, but your soil life is going to come up and break that down, just like leaves decompose on top of the ground. That's going to be happening continually from the soil food web, breaking down that detritus or that mulch that you put on. So what you mulch is really important, because that is a long-term food source for your soil food web. You'd like to balance that food source and make it so that what you're adding back in regularly is going to support and maintain the thriving populations of life that you want. Not to mention that mulching keeps the topsoil moist. So whenever you got that topsoil covered, what's going to happen is it's not going to dry out from evaporation. And if it's uncovered, especially outdoors, and I'm used to growing in Colorado, you cannot have bare soil in Colorado. If you do that, like the top 5 inches of your soil will just be like dust. It's just like bone dry. And that top few inches of your soil is where all the feeder roots of your plants are. So I don't know if you guys knew this, but probably like 70–80% of all your plant's nutrition, maybe more. I don't know an exact figure here, but a large majority of your plant's nutrition is all going to be uptaken from the top like 4, 6, or 6 inches of soil. If you let that dry out, now you got just like maybe what's underneath that dry layer on top. And that's not where your fresh mulch is. That's not where all your organic matter is going to be. So mulching also just keeps the soil food web active, because your topsoil is going to be moist and the microbes are going to be in there doing their work. All the roots of your plants in your topsoil, that's where all the root hairs are as well. If you've ever noticed, like all the really fine root hairs and stuff are usually in your topsoil, because that's where they're doing the rhizophagy. They're spitting bacteria out of those root hair tips, and they're also like absorbing tons of nutrition through them. So mulching is just like hugely important. When I say amending, that's distinct from mulching, because amending, what we mean by that is that usually you got a soil test and you're adding back in something that correlates with what you need. Okay, so you don't have to have a soil test, and you can still amend whatever, you know, top dress some crab meal and some kelp meal or whatever for nutrition. And but when we say amending, we basically mean adding some kind of dry amendment, fertilizer back into the topsoil. And we like to do that underneath the mulch too, because like I said, how the mulch keeps it moist. When we mulch, or when we amend, I should say, we don't always, it's not like we lift the mulch up or peel it back, but if we sprinkle it on top of the mulch, then we come by with like a high-powered hose or like hose attachment, and we'll make sure that we wash all of those amendments through the mulch layer. Because where we want these amendments is underneath the mulch, in contact with the topsoil, and we want to draw all of the biology up to the top to come and cycle that nutrition. So under the mulch is like the perfect place to put your amendment. If you haven't mulched yet, put your amendments down first. So like you make a brand new soil, if you want to amend that soil or put some top dress nutrition on top for long-term release, do that first. and then put your straw or your, greens or whatever you're mulching with, your wood chips, put that on top of the amendments, and you'll get a quicker and better release of your amendment into the soil. Already talked about mulching. What can you mulch? So anything you want, but again, balanced diet is going to be important. So a lot of times we just take our prunings, and anytime we have a pruning event in the greenhouse, a lot of it just gets chopped and dropped. So we cut it, goes right back down onto the soil. Another way that this methodology saves time and money. You don't have to worry about like bagging up all your waste and doing something with it. It's just like nature. The leaves of the trees fall down, they decompose to feed the plant next year. Same thing we're doing here. Having a balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to encourage the right type of breakdown. So when you're composting, you do the same thing. You want a certain ratio of greens and browns because the greens are a source of nitrogen along with other things, and the carbon is going to come from your woody materials like wood chips or straw, your browns. So greens and browns, having the right mix of those, or just even, you don't have to be exact with it, but if you mulch a bunch of prunings like fresh cannabis leaf and stalk, try and mix that together with some straw and some wood chips or something like that. If you do that and then you mulch that all together, top dress that all together, you're going to get more microbial activity, more even and quicker breakdown of your mulch layer, which is essentially more nutrient cycling. That's what happens there. You can also chop and drop cover crops. So if you're growing other crops in there, that's a great thing to do. And fermented organic matter. So I'll talk about one of the things we do here is bokashi. Has anyone heard of bokashi fermentation? A couple people. That uses bacteria, primarily Bacillus species, to ferment in an anaerobic environment. So what we'll do is sometimes we don't want to mulch all of our prunings, for example. Instead of mulching them straight onto the topsoil, maybe we already have a really thick mulch layer or something, right? And we don't want to smother our soil out. So we're like, okay, it's not the right time to mulch more, but we will take and fill up a 55-gallon drum. You can do this with a 5-gallon bucket as well, or any size container. We'll put all our prunings into a bucket, and then we'll fill that barrel with water and inoculate it with the bacterias that do the ferment, pH it down, and maybe add a little sugar or something like that to kind of kickstart the microbial activity. But then we'll cap it with a lid, an airtight lid, and sometimes we have like a little airlock valve that allows air to escape but nothing to come in. Because fermentation is an anaerobic process, okay? And one of the benefits of fermenting things, there's a couple of them, but one is that once it's been fermented, it's kind of like pre-digested or pre-composted. And it's the same reason why kimchi and yogurt is really good for our bodies. It's really easy to digest, and it's full of probiotics, which are other microbes that did the fermentation. Those are good microbes for our gut biology. And so when you eat fermented foods, it's real easy on your stomach. You digest it quick and you get good nutrient uptake from that fermented food. And you also get the benefits of all the microbiology that comes along with it. So it's the same thing with feeding our soil, is fermented organic matter. It's going to break down very quickly. And it's going to be full of all of these different unique microorganisms that you might not get from just the regular compost. You know, it's like these are what we usually call facultative anaerobes, meaning they can operate with or without oxygen. And when they're fermenting, they're not using oxygen. They're doing cellular respiration with no oxygen. And the way that process works processes the nutrition in that material in a different way than aerobic digestive processes do, okay? So you get a material and you get a type of microorganism that has a different and unique digestive capability. Ultimately, a different ability to feed your plant nutrients in different forms, which again, that's what this is all about. How broad of a diversity of diet can we feed our plants? Because the more diversity of our feed and the more complex our feed is, the more complex our terpene and cannabinoid profiles are going to be. So fermenting stuff is really great. I'll tell you guys a quick story about this. One thing that I like to do is ferment all of my kitchen scraps. Like, I have a bucket in my kitchen, and every meal that I cook, any waste from that meal goes right into the bucket. And as I'm filling that bucket, I'm inoculating it with the bacteria that do fermentation. When it gets full all the way, I add the water and I let it bubble for another 3 weeks. And I've got a fermented bucket full of my kitchen scraps. One cool thing about bokashi fermentation is it can take all sorts of stuff that a regular compost pile can't. So you can ferment dairy, oils, meats, and bones. Also, like, basically anything can go into a bokashi bucket. You want to avoid processed stuff and chemical stuff, but hopefully you're not eating that in your diet anyway. So one time early on when I was first learning how to do bokashi fermentation, I had a big pack of, like, one of those bulk packs from Costco or something of drumsticks, chicken drumsticks, and I forgot about it in the refrigerator and it went bad. And I was like, shoot, okay. Well, let's just throw it in the bokashi bucket. So I filled up like a quarter of this bokashi bucket with drumsticks, like raw chicken drumsticks, right? Rest of the bucket's full of whatever else, and I ferment that. And once the ferment's done, I'm like, okay, now I'm gonna mulch this. I'm gonna top dress it. And so I'm literally in my garden, and I'm wearing gloves because it's nasty, but I'm pulling out fermented raw chicken drumsticks, okay? And I'm peeling back my mulch layer. This was in a smaller home grow, my small 30 light home grow. I'm mulching these kitchen scraps underneath, and it's the chicken bone and drumsticks. And I'm like, okay, this is gonna be interesting. I've never fed my soil meat before, like raw meat. So I'm like, I wonder what's gonna happen. And every day I went back after I did that and I would check. I'd go back to the containers where I put that stuff out. I'd lift up the mulch layer and see, like, what kind of activity is happening. Are there bugs crawling all over this stuff now? Are they breaking down, whatever? So it's like 4 days, nothing, 5 days, still nothing, 6 days, chicken drumsticks just like sitting there. I'm like, okay, I got raw chicken on top of my pots, whatever. I think it was probably like 7 or 8 days later, I go back to look and I lift it up, gone. Like, I'm telling you, nothing there. And just basically a pile of worm castings, okay? And this is what you'll see when you mulch like fermented stuff, is that coming out of the ferment, it's really acidic. So it needs about 4 or 5 days or so, usually, and something happens of it sitting exposed to the environment in your mulch layer over that period of time, where after like 4 or 5 days or a week or so, the soil biology is now able to get at it. It's able to access it. And if you're checking like this, like, and you mulch a bunch of fermented food scraps, if you catch it at the right time, I missed it. And when I checked, the bones and everything, all gone. But if you catch it at the right time, sometimes you'll lift up your mulch layer and what you'll see is, like, it's crazy. It'll be like a ball of worms just surrounding like an apple core or an avocado pit or something like that. It'll just be like a ball of worms covered in bugs and all this. And it's just like basically just annihilating that fermented food source. And it's really cool because like, oh my God, like, this is going straight into the food web. And this is one of my biggest secrets to quality and yield at the same time, is like, if you ferment things that you mulch before you put them into your system, there is no quicker way to get a high level of nutrition from the top of the food web, which we're talking, it's a human being's kitchen, right, that this stuff is coming out of. So this food is diverse and full of enough nutrition to feed me as a human being, and I'm taking all the scraps of that, fermenting it and putting it right back in, when those worms and bugs come and destroy that stuff, it's going right back to the base of the food web. And there's not a lot of loss in that. Whereas if you do a normal compost pile, especially like an aerobic, thermophilic outdoor compost pile, a lot, like for instance, you're gonna lose 80% of your nitrogen to off-gassing. But if that material is locked in a bucket that is sealed, you're not losing any nutrition out of that. All those ferment microbes are just processing that and pre-digesting that, and then when you mulch that onto your beds or your containers, it's like gonna go right back in really fast. So whenever I top dress bokashi fermented material, whether it's food scraps or cannabis waste or anything like that, I see from doing that the biggest bump in biology and plant health overall from anything else that I do. So if you guys have never tried that, that's like secret tip, mulch the pulp. A lot of people take the liquid from those, and if you've ever seen fermented plant extracts, that's my friend Miles in Colorado, who created that brand. He just ferments, he does a bokashi ferment, and then he strains the liquid out, and he bottles the liquid. So if you buy a fermented plant extract from Build-A-Soil or from Miles, what you're getting is the liquid. What I'm talking about is using the solids. So the liquid's great, and we do that too. Like past few weeks, we've been feeding a ferment liquid here of the same thing, but we also make sure to top dress that material as the pulp, because like the response that produces is greater than anything I've ever seen. So major tip there. One thing I'll say about cover crops, it's not always ideal to have cover crops going at the same time as your cannabis, especially sometimes when you're using things like clover or other species that share some of the same pest predators. Like clover can attract both spider mites and aphids, okay, major cannabis pests. And that will oftentimes happen as your cover crop gets older. And if you're growing it as a companion with your cannabis, when the cannabis takes up all the canopy and is getting all the light, then your cover crops that are growing underneath don't get as much light. They start to get unhealthy. And then they can sometimes pull in pests and things like that. So you want to be careful of that. A lot of times the way that we deal with that is we'll grow cover crops during veg, and then as the canopy starts to fill out, we'll chop and drop all the cover crops, terminate the whole blend of cover crops, and mulch that to be recycled. Now when you do that, all of the biomass above ground becomes mulch, and that's going to feed your soil food web, right? But these plants also had roots in the soil. So when you terminate them, those roots die off and they decompose, and that's more food for all of the biology in your soil. So cover crops are great even when they're not alive, because when you terminate them, they just become more food. But when they are alive, one of the biggest benefits of them is that they all produce a different exudate profile. So you remember how I said plants photosynthesize and then they pump out these exudates to feed the microbiology? Well, clover produces different root exudates than vetch does, than rye does, than oats do, and than cannabis. So a lot of times when you're growing cover crops, we recommend having at least 4 different species going, because when you have a bunch of different species, you've got a bunch of different root exudate profiles going into the soil, and it's again encouraging more diversity of biology. So that's a nice tip there. And then also mention the variety of biomass is also going to encourage diversity. Everything we're doing is encourage diversity. Okay, so that's the end of the slideshow. You guys know what we're doing here now. You know why we're doing it, and you know how to maintain it once you have it. Now we're going to move into hands-on, and we're going to make the soil mix, and then we'll do some Q&A after that. But let's see, what time is it? Great, we're like right on track. Do you guys want to take a quick break for bathroom, food, and whatever, and then we'll come back and we'll start the soil? Okay, so up on the screen there, and you guys can check that out later, I made this spreadsheet that is a soil calculator. One of the biggest pain in the ass things about making soil like this is every time you make a batch, or each one of you guys individually might want to make a different amount. So you can take a basic recipe, but then you have to figure out like, okay, if I'm 40% peat moss, how much of that is, let's say you're making a yard of soil, so how much peat moss is 40% of a yard? These are compressed bales. How much does that bale actually expand to? Like, there's all these different kind of pain in the ass things for calculating all of this out. So finally I just got fed up with that, and I made a spreadsheet that all I have to do is change the number of what the total amount I want is, and then it'll spit out every ingredient and how much of each one I need. So if anybody wants to, you know, have access to that, or if you have a certain amount of soil in mind that you're trying to make a recipe for, then let me know, and we can just put that number into the spreadsheet, and you guys can take a picture of it, and you'll know exactly what your ingredients are. Hey Travis, you know that plastic, the transfer shovel that's like got the big scoop and it's plastic?
Yeah.
You know where that is? I was looking for it, I couldn't find it.
Oh, right there.
Ah, nice.
Got it.
Okay, never mind.
Something. Oh, no, you're good.
Yeah. Okay, so here I had 2 bales of peat moss at home. So what we're gonna do is make an amount that works with this. So 2 bales of peat moss expands, these are 3 cubic foot bales. They're gonna expand to about 4.3, 4.4 cubic feet. A cubic foot is about 7.5 gallons. These are like this is a 20 gallon pot here, which I was just talking with some people in here about the minimum size container you want. I would say this is about it. Like, I wouldn't go any smaller than a 20 gallon pot when you're doing, if you want to grow no-till style like this. But 30 is better, and even bigger is better. Always go with the biggest you can. So if you're in a 4x4 tent, I was saying you probably want to consider just doing a 4x4 bed in that tent. You know, go wall-to-wall soil. The more soil you do, the easier it is, and the bigger your buffer for margin of error is going to be. You can let that dry out more, and it won't, you know, the biology won't die off. You have to water it less. It's just easier. So the more soil you use, the easier it's going to be, and the better results you're going to get. But I just use my soil calculator to figure out what is the amount. And so today we're going to make about 0.8 yards. So that's probably going to be like, it says it right here. It's 162 gallons. So if you got 20 gallon pots, this is going to make enough for 8 pots. And the cost of this is less than you're going to spend filling, you know, buying 162 gallons of soil is like, you know, if you're talking $30 a bag of soil, you know, that adds up pretty quick. And these ingredients are cheaper. So let's get started here. And the way that I figured out how much a bale of this expands to is just using 5-gallon buckets. We know 7.5 gallons is a cubic foot. So this is a 3 cubic foot bale. And I filled up 5-gallon buckets and just counted it up. So I know these are going to be about 4.3 cubic feet. And we'll start by dumping this out. I would love volunteers that want to get hands-on with this too and help us mix. I've done this a million times, but you guys can get your own practice. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Thanks, man.
You got it.
You can dump that over on that side. All right, so the recipe for this mix is 40% peat moss and 25% compost. I'm doing 35% aeration. So if you've heard of a Coots mix before, a Coots mix is basically 1/3 of each. Compost 1/3, peat moss 1/3, aeration 1/3. I'm using rice hulls and perlite. A combination of the two is the aeration component. So that's going to be, I'm going to use 15% of the total mix in rice hulls. 20% is going to be the perlite. And then we're going to measure the compost. I brought a bunch of different types of compost over here. So let's talk about this for a minute too. The compost, these two right here are from the Johnson Sioux bioreactor that we have out over there. If you guys have been to previous classes, maybe some of you saw it, but this is amazing compost. It was a static pile that was, so that means we didn't turn this compost pile, and it was really heavy on carbon. We made it with a lot of wood chips, a lot of dried out cannabis stalk. There's some coffee grounds in here, as well as eggshells. What else is in here, Travis? There's like beer grains. We get spent beer grains from Prison City and some of the other breweries around here. Bunch of stuff. So this compost is probably almost 1.5 years old, and it came out really fantastic. This is a thing that I like to do as well, is for each component, it's good to use more than one type of thing. So your categories are your peat moss, your aeration, and your compost, but I like to use a few different types of compost. Like I've got Johnson Sioux compost here. This was a windrow pile that we had, or it was just a big pile as well that sat for a long time. And this one down here is a wood chip pile that's over 4 years old. And this stuff is amazing. It's like, this isn't even screened, and you can see it's like just amazing compost. There's worms, and there's living life in this right now, which you will not get from the store. So if you buy compost, the chances of you getting like worms and cocoons and bugs and stuff in it are essentially zero. So making your own compost could be the largest upgrade you make to your garden, especially if you're making your own soil, and if you're making compost teas or amending your soil. It's going to be really, really huge to be able to do that. And if any of you have questions as we go about the different components, let me know. See how much compost it is. Okay, so we need 5.4 cubic feet of compost, which is actually about 8 5-gallon buckets. So does somebody want to measure us out 8 5-gallon buckets? You can use this shovel too.
Which one?
Actually, so matter of fact, I know that there is 3 5-gallon buckets in these two. Okay. So let's just dump these. And actually, don't dump all of that. Take 1 5-gallon bucket out of that, and let's use the rest of this. That was, I believe, 2 5-gallon buckets. That was 10 gallons there. Let's use this one too. So we didn't screen this compost. There's some like chunks of wood chips and stuff in here, which is not ideal. This is like mulch grade before it's screened, but it's okay for this because we know it's well aged and it's not going to steal nitrogen or anything from the mix.
Want 1 5-gallon out of this one?
Yeah, that was the middle one.
This is
Yeah.
the middle one.
Yeah, let's use just one of that. Actually, cool. Okay, and then the pumice, we need 4.32 cubic feet, which is,
Use the perlite for that.
yep. 4.32 times 7.5 gallons per cubic foot, 32.4 gallons. So that's 6.5 5-gallon buckets.
What's 4 cubic feet equal to be on that calculator?
So you
6.5 5-gallon.
Or rice hulls, mix
I'm using both. Yep. Yep.
to add up to the 6.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm using 6.5 of perlite, and then we're going to use, so it's 4.32 cubic feet of perlite and 3.24 cubic feet of rice hulls. So 3.24 times 7.5, 24. So let's round it up. Let's call it 5 gallon buckets of this, 6.5 5-gallon buckets of that.
This is 20 gallons, correct?
Yeah, but don't use that to measure. Just do the, because I don't know where the line of 20 gallons is. It's probably somewhere around there.
So if you like rice hulls and not so much perlite, because the perlite flows around, gets all over the place. Do the rice hulls break down though, right? Over
Over time they do.
a couple years?
Yeah, yeah.
A couple years, then you re-amend with some more
Yep,
aeration.
yep. I still like it better than perlite though. Perlite, I forget what it's made out of, but it's
Lava, expanded lava rock.
it's something like that. Yeah.
So would it be the same numbers if he switched that out for the shale you were talking about?
Yes. Yep.
Or lava rock, right?
Or lava rock.
I bought a bunch of lava rock or grills, and they're in golf-hole-sized chunks.
Yeah, that's a little too big.
Anybody have an idea how to break them down?
No, I've tried. I tried. It doesn't work well at all. Yeah.
It's like steamroller.
Diamond, right? Big diamond, right?
Yeah.
Volcanic rock.
Now, I will mention here too, guys, for safety purposes, it's a good idea to wear a mask when you're mixing this stuff. So if you're dumping perlite and stuff, just make sure you're not breathing anything in. And then whoever is doing the mixing, I did bring a respirator, and we have other respirators around here. So if anybody wants to do the mixing. The other thing is too, you can add water to keep the dust down. One nice thing is I just pulled all this compost from the piles outside. It's actually got a lot of water in it. So once we start mixing this together, I think it's probably going to not kick up a whole lot of dust. But let's just be conscious of that. And if there's any dust flying around in here, let's make sure nobody's breathing it in. And if anyone's doing direct mixing, make sure to get a mask on or something.
I like to, when I'm mixing it, I'll put down like the peat first, and then the aeration, and then the compost on top, and it
Yeah.
gets that dust down. The initial mixing too.
Good idea. I think I'm inhaling perlite dust right now. Okay, so this is your base, okay? Your 3 components right here, your peat moss, your aeration, and your compost. That's your base. Now we're gonna look at amendments, and I classify my amendments into 2 categories. The first one is nutrient amendments, and for those we're going to use kelp meal, neem seed meal, and crab meal. So Down to Earth is a good brand. Oh no.
I'm just gonna suck this out real quick.
Oh, okay.
Help with the dust for you guys. Sorry.
Thanks. Okay. Another good thing I figured out about the math on this recipe is that it comes to approximately 5 pounds of each of these. And guess what? These are 5-pound boxes. So we're just going to dump each one of these nutrient amendments in. Somebody want to do the kelp? Neem. Thank you. Yeah, and try and spread it around. It mixes better if you kind of get it dispersed out.
How much rice hull do you want to make?
5 gallon buckets, 25 gallons. Watch out, pigbat. Okay, so that's our nutrient amendments. Yes. You still got the knife? Okay. Now, why these amendments, okay? So they have NPK values on them, so we know that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, this is 6%, 1%, 2%, you know how those work. So you're getting those primary nutrients, but each of these things have micronutrients in them as well, especially the kelp. The kelp is a really good source of micronutrients. One thing I'll mention about kelp is that you want to be careful with the kelp sourcing, because some kelp has been known to have heavy metals in it, and arsenic in particular. So if you are a professional grow that needs to pass heavy metal testing with your final product, you'll want to make sure that you're not adding any additional heavy metals. You can get good clean kelp, and I think Down to Earth is pretty good, but I'm going to be honest with you, I've never had it tested. So if you're making a soil for a licensed grow operation, just make sure you source some good kelp. I know Build-A-Soil has some that they consider to be safe, and they make a lot of their soils with it. So that's a good choice for that. You guys are having problems.
Get a smaller bag, I don't know where those are.
Yeah. Where's the big shovel? Thank you. Okay, so next is minerals. I'll wait for the noise to die down. Okay. Sweet. Thanks, guys. Good on that? Okay. Okay, so base is done, nutrient amendments are done. I mentioned a little bit about what each one is. The neem is a good nitrogen source. That's the primary nitrogen source besides our compost. It also has some nice pest repellent properties. Certain soil dwelling pests do not like neem. They don't like the oils from it. So I like it for that reason also. Kelp is full of good micronutrients and also has some good plant hormones and certain things in it like that. And then the crab shell has nitrogen as well as phosphorus, potassium, I think. And then it's also good for calcium. So chitin is an ingredient that is like crustacean shells have a lot of chitin, insect shells have chitin, and chitinase, the enzyme that breaks that down, is something that is known to trigger immune response in plants. So that's a nice benefit from the crab. But also, cannabis cannot get enough calcium. You guys may have heard this before, but like it is just a calcium hog, and a lot of other plants like a lot of calcium too, but cannabis in particular, we have not even found the upper limits of how much calcium a cannabis plant will uptake, and there's been no detriment to, you know, the highest levels of it. So basically you just can't get enough calcium. You do want to be careful not to imbalance your soil with it though. So there's a certain range on your soil tests that you're going to look to hit when you're making the mix. And this recipe is designed to put you in a good range for calcium. The relationship between calcium and potassium, that ratio and calcium, having those things in the right proportions to each other is going to be a major, you know, important thing. So the recipe really does matter. And, you know, you guys may feel a lot more comfortable mixing soils after today, but I would definitely advise you not to go crazy, try and alter things and do all sorts of custom stuff like that, unless you're going to do the testing. If you're going to do the testing and get good professional guidance on how to balance a soil properly, go for it. I think that's a great experience. But just know, like, when you deviate from the proven recipes and things like that, you might not see the same results. So let's move to minerals. Minerals are like a huge, huge important part. It's a major source of micronutrients. And on the papers that I have up there that came with these minerals, it shows the breakdown of all the different minerals that are there. It's going to be a lot of calcium and magnesium in there too. Going to be a lot of silicon in there. But as I like to do with compost, I like to use a few different sources. We have worm castings here too. I should have even gotten some worm castings, because worm castings count as compost. In case anyone was wondering, if you have worm casting compost, you can use that for however much of your organic matter component you want as well. But the same thing with minerals. Like, a lot of people will just make a Coots mix like this using something like basalt. So here we've got, this is a what they call Brix Blend basalt from a company called Rock Dust Local. This is kind of like one of the best all-purpose remineralizing amendments that you can get. But same principle, right? Like, I don't want to use just one source, because the more diversity, the better. So instead of just using the Brix Blend basalt, I also got these basalt microfines over here, which also basalt, so same rock. I think the source might be different, but also the texture is different. the consistency of this is like flour, whereas, and you guys can feel this all you want if you want to check it out, but this is like flour. It kind of clumps up like that. Whereas this basalt here, if you squeeze it, it doesn't hold together the same way. There's bigger particles in here. And so this is going to be a broad spectrum of release because there's some microfines in here, but there's also bigger particles. This mineral is going to break down more over time, whereas the microfines are going to be available right off the bat. And this one right here in the middle, this is granite. So this is a local rock dust that's easy to find around here. And granite, just a different micronutrient and mineral profile than the others. So we throw all of those in. Then we're using oyster shell, which is essentially calcium carbonate. And I just mentioned the importance of calcium. So this is a different source of calcium than the gypsum and the crab and crustacean meal that we're using. The gypsum is calcium sulfate. So we have calcium sulfate. And this is a micronized sort of flour consistency, just like this. The rates that we're doing is on the basalt, which is the main mineral ingredient. We're doing 2 cups per cubic foot. We're doing a 1/2 cup per cubic foot of granite, a 1/2 cup of the microfines, and 1 cup per cubic foot of the gypsum. That is a total, I believe, of 4.5 cubic foot of mineral, or 4.5 cups per cubic foot of rock dust. Now, if you think about that, 7.5 gallons is a cubic foot. So we're putting 4.5 cups of rock dust into every 7.5 gallons of soil. There is no bagged soil that has that in it. That's one of the biggest benefits of making your own soil, is you can get the minerals in it that you need. These rock dusts are like absolutely key to quality and yields and pest and disease resistance, because they contain a lot of those micronutrients and things that you're just not going to get otherwise. So hugely important component here, and you just want to make sure that you get that part right. So let's do some measuring. I think we said 2 cups per cubic foot of that. I'll tell you the totals. $43 cups of the first one here. So that's a lot of scoops. You getting a bigger one? Okay. Then we need 11 cups of the microfines. So does somebody want to do 11 cups of this one? There's your 2 cup mark right there. 1 cup. Yep, this one here. And the same with the granite next to it. So if you want to go 11, you can, or pass it off to somebody else. Okay, something I don't have here today, which can be a nice addition that I would put in the mineral category, is some pure silica. However, not essential, because there is a lot of silica in these rock dusts. If you didn't know, silica is the most abundant element in soil on the planet. There's a lot of silica in soil.
You said?
Yeah. Oh yeah, this is the 12 cup scoop.
This is 22. Two of these are basically what you need.
Okay. Here.
Yeah.
We're going to
Right there.
Okay. Go ahead. Throw that right in there too.
So we start mixing it up.
Not yet. We got to get. You did both of these, right? Okay, great. Thank you. Now we need. Would somebody like to do 22 cups of this gypsum?
I can do it.
Okay.
22?
Yep. And then we need 11 cups of oyster shell flour. Which I believe is one of these, actually, the whole box. So let me see. Yeah, it's usually depends on how heavy it is. Yeah, some of them are, like, let's see, I actually have the material weights in the spreadsheet. So oyster shell weighs 8 ounces per cup. And it's a total of, 5 pounds. So the oyster shell, it's 5.4 pounds, but close enough. We can just dump this in. Yep. And then did we do the gypsum already?
We just did it, yep.
Oh, you just did the gypsum. Okay. All right, who wants to do some turning? Nobody. They're like, no.
You're like, where's the cement mixer?
Yeah.
Where's the other shovel?
Plastic shovel. Cool. Yeah, so when I do this part, I just go around in a circle and I just keep going and going. And it's really important to get it thoroughly homogenized. So a lot of times you think you'll have it thoroughly mixed, and then when you start filling your containers, you'll realize, oh crap, like I actually didn't mix it as well as I thought. So, you kind of just go until you think it's good enough. Try and move it that way away from the drain too, if you guys can. I like to just tell people, go until you think it's like thoroughly mixed, and then just keep going more. Every time you think that you've got it like thoroughly mixed, just keep going.
I know this sucks doing this right now, but you're only going to do it one time.
Exactly.
You're not changing your pots every single time.
Yep.
Like a tear down and a reset. I don't know. I
Drop it in the middle.
Yep. Now imagine you guys have just a 4x4 tent going. Like, you're probably going to get 5 cycles per year out of that tent if you're on top of turning it over, right? Now, you do this one time, you fill up your containers, and then the other 4 cycles you don't have to do anything, versus having to empty out all that soil, throw it away, or compost it, whatever. Like, it's just so much less work but it's more work up front. If you're willing to do the work up front, you're going to save yourself a ton of time and money in the long run, which is one of the reasons this method is so highly effective at a commercial scale. Is we don't have to deal with those costs anymore. After we hit our point of return on investment, it's all, it keeps our cost of production lower than our competition, because our competition's going to have to buy new soil every single round, and we don't have to do that. Yeah, get through the middle there. Here's another trick I like to do, is just go right down the center. I need a mask. Thanks. You're going to notice a lot of clumps. It's a good idea to go through by hand and just crumble these things up. So there's actually a lot more mixing to do here. Even though you'd think like this is well done, it's not. I would say what we've done so far, we probably want to double. Yeah, we're maybe we're halfway there. Does anyone want to help me break up clumps too? We can go through and just break up some of these clumps.
Can you put water in that?
This came from outside, all the compost.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, it had lots of water in it. You can smell the neem. The neem is strong.
You want to get buried? There's no bugs this time.
All right, let's turn it some more. I have to wash my hands after this. So, sometimes you can see the pockets, of stuff that didn't get mixed. A lot of times you'll see minerals.
Watch it pearling.
Yeah. All right. This might be good enough, but remember my rule. As soon as you think it's good enough, keep going, right?
What are some other methods then you could do this, besides hand, obviously a machine,
Yes.
but like what are some other methods you would suggest?
Kids, yeah. It's a good one.
I was thinking like cement mixer, but couldn't do it.
Yeah. So I have tried one of those little portable cement mixers. If you guys know,
Like a compost bin, you tumbled it.
compost bin might work better if you have a tumbler. So there's you guys can try some different ways, but
Tiller to like do the base of it, and then you come back in with a shovel to just do the finish.
what do you use?
Like a handheld tiller. I have one that's
Oh, nice.
on a weed whacker.
It's like a weed, it's like an electric,
Get
it's not
in
like
there.
a heavy grade tiller.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this one's like a steel weed whacker frame
Yeah.
with a tiller on the end of it, and you get into it with that, and then it's
Yep.
like, okay, just a little shovel.
Yeah. Now, if I was mixing this myself by hand, I'd probably sit here and shovel it for about 30 minutes. Just straight on, just do like 30 minutes. But again, what's 30 minutes when it's like you only have to do this once?
Right.
How big of a bed will this provide?
This is 162 gallons, I think it was. So this is just under a yard.
4x4 pretty much.
Yeah,
2 inches, 24 inches.
sounds about right. Yeah. Yeah. But
For a tent anyway.
yeah, and this is one, it seems like it's a lot, but this would do like one 4x4 tent for me.
Yeah. And how many,
Yeah, it's 7.
watching your other videos, I see how many clones you stack in one bed.
Yeah,
How many clones would you try stacking into that one 4x4 area?
depends on the strain. Totally strain dependent, but yeah. Now, for most genetics though, my rule is like the more the better. Yeah, I pretty much, you can overstack it, but then you just have to prune a little. I like to veg for as little time as possible. So when you're growing in living soil like this, that's one of the challenges is like, you might be used to, yeah, or you're vegging some in another space and then you move your stuff into the flower room. Well, in this, it's, you can yield better, I think, when you do it this way compared to moving plants in sometimes, because you actually get to veg it right into your screen. So if you've got your trellis netting out already, you can use that as like a guide to fill your canopy and just veg it until everything looks like it's nice and evenly full, and then you can hit the flower button at that point. This shovel's awesome. You need one of these for doing this. This is awesome. I did my last batch with a regular like square shovel, and it's just it takes forever compared to this. Yeah. So we still have like some clumps. We could go through and break up a lot of these, would probably help. But we don't have to sit here and do this forever. I think some of you guys are already asking questions, but we can just go to Q&A, and like, if you guys have questions about anything around this, any part of the presentation, just feel free to ask while we're doing it.
Seeds in the same soil?
Are we doing what?
Are you popping your seeds in the same soil?
Yep, this soil,
Like your 1,000 run that was in here last time we were in here,
it wasn't this, no.
but you are now.
Not popping
You are.
seeds right now.
Yeah, we're just not doing seeds
But you
anymore.
are though. That's what I'm asking. If you were popping seeds, you would use the same soil
Yeah.
from start.
Yeah,
It's not too hot for the seedling?
not at all. No. This is a good question, guys, because basically what you're trying to ask here is this too strong for a small plant? Yeah, and the answer is no, it's not. This is great for seedlings. In fact, stuff will take right off in this mix. So you can plant your clones directly into it. You can pop seeds in it if you want. It's not going to burn your plants. And that's one nice thing about organic amendments is it's going to be a nice even release. It's only going to release nutrition as fast as the soil food web cycles it.
My other question would be to you is, once we get this thoroughly mixed, you have to let it sit for at least 6 weeks?
Nope, you can use it right away.
It's ready, available?
Yep. Now, it is better if you let it sit.
Cook it. They call it cooking, you know?
Yeah,
Yes.
well, they're saying, you know, when I see super soils, they're saying that keep it stored, you know, covered for 6 weeks, let it do its cooking process, and then it'll be available.
Yeah. Yep.
So this stuff is just ready, available?
It's ready to go. But it is better if you let it sit.
Okay.
You wanna moisten it and
Yeah, wet it down.
yep, and then let it sit. So this is another good question, guys. They want to know if we should let this cook. The answer to that is you don't have to, but it's better if you do. So in fact, I will probably take this home and plant stuff in it this afternoon. And it's fine. It's going to be ready to go today. Yep. It's a nice thing about it. But if you do let it cook, it is going to be better. In fact, my recommendation for best practice would be to wet it down with a solution that includes your microbial inoculation.
JMS or something.
Yes. Yep. Root-wise, if you're using JMS, JMS is a Jadam preparation, stands for Jadam Microbial Solution. So that's a homemade microbial inoculant that's pretty fast and easy to make. Falls into the same category as compost teas and extracts. So if you've got good compost, bubble it up. You know, get it going, make an extract or a tea out of it. One thing I'll say about compost tea also is if you don't know microscopy, I would be very, very careful with brewing teas. A lot of people are cavalier with tea brewing and they don't realize until it's too late that they might be actually brewing something that's not very good. You can easily brew pathogenic stuff if you don't know what you're doing. And even like we know what we're doing, but we still check most of our brews with a microscope before we actually use it. Extracts, however, if you haven't heard of a compost extract, they are amazing. It's really just as effective as a compost tea in many ways. With a tea, you're brewing it over time, usually 24 to 36 hours. So whatever's developing in there, the idea is you're going to multiply certain biology. However, good compost already has so much good biology in it that you can just make an extract, which is essentially taking that tea or taking that compost and agitating it to dislodge the microbiology and get it into the water solution. And you can water that compost extract right in. You know, an extract only takes 15 minutes, 30 minutes. You can bubble it for an hour or two if you want. And then just take that liquid, and that's what I would wet down this soil with so that you get those microbes in there. They're going to start working. I would also introduce your mycorrhizae and your any store-bought product that you're going to use. I would do that at the same time. And if you let it sit for 2 weeks, that's great. 3 days is fine. And like I said, you can use it now if you want to as well, but it's...
Do you use that, what's that powder that Build the Soil recommends that he puts serotonin, or is it serotonin, or what's he put in his water that makes it like soap?
Oh,
Waters down.
you're talking about saponins.
Saponin, there you go.
Yeah.
You guys use that?
Yes.
Do you guys use that in
Yeah.
the soil too? When you're watering?
Not the specific one that he uses.
But you use something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this question's about wetting agents, which saponins are a typical wetting agent, and they're present in many different things like aloe vera. Kiwaha is the one that you're thinking of, the powder that Build a Soil sells.
Yeah, I've seen in his videos, whatever he uses in his videos, he
Yep.
makes like...
has a version too. Lacoste has a version.
Yep. There's a lot of different wetting agent products. And what a wetting agent does is just kind of like, Makes water wetter, exactly. And it's gonna make it spread through your soil. We like to use it more so when when we're inoculating or doing a soil drench by hand. We'll oftentimes add a wetting agent in to help increase penetration and the distribution flow of that water throughout the soil.
The water just sits on top, so it's...
Yeah, yep. So it helps it penetrate in, helps it spread throughout the soil better. And wetting agents are especially useful for foliar applications. When you are making a foliar spray, one of the best things to do is add a wetting agent because it's going to help that water spread out across the leaf surface. You always want to use RO water for foliar sprays, and you always want to add a wetting agent, in my opinion, unless you're using a product that's specifically designed to already work the way it is. A lot of products have wetting agents in them already, but if you do a lot of homemade foliars and stuff like we do, we almost always add a wetting agent.
Do any JDM wetting agents here or no?
We've used Jadam wetting agent before. I have some at my house, but I just use whatever I have. Yeah, it's usually aloe or... Yeah, JWA is easy to make, so you know that's a good wetting agent. Yeah, that's the design of Jadam. It's supposed to be like super easy. Yeah. All right, so this is pretty much done. Do we have any more questions about this right now?
How do you store finished compost that, you know, say you're not going to use it to the spring? Over the winter, do you cover it? Do you not cover it?
Yeah, covering it is a good idea to prevent weed seeds from blowing into it in the springtime, for sure. So, like, we had a compost pile out there that we left uncovered, and then one day Travis was like, actually, I think I was like, where's the compost pile? I was like, where, didn't we have this pile of like really nice 4-plus-year-old wood chips that got composted? He's like, it's right there. And I'm like, where? Right there. What? And it's like, yeah, it looked like a pile of just earth with plants growing out of it. So.
But you want it wet before you cover it, right?
You can, yeah, you can wet it or not. I mean, if you're storing it outside here and it's a porous cover, not like a plastic tarp or something like that, I wouldn't cover it with something that's not breathable. I'd want to have it breathing because that'll keep it, you know, aerobic and healthy to some extent. But yeah, I'd probably just store it outside. I'd cover it to keep weed seeds from blowing in, and yeah. Yep, and I'd always, like, if I'm storing compost long term, I'd make sure to check it with the microscope before we start using it. Yeah.